Good evening, all. Tonight we are talking about Sir Isaac Newton and Sir Thomas Hobbes as we enter the late Renaissance, the end of the early classical period, or the early modern period, rather. And so we are entering a period of time that is known commonly as the Enlightenment. For those of you who like to jot little parenthetical notes to yourselves, you will want to record that the Enlightenment stretches from 1596 to 1804. From the birth of René Descartes to the death of Immanuel Kant. Now, we're not overly interested in Isaac Newton for the sake of philosophy. However, we are interested in what can be done with Sir Isaac Newton's thought. So we've kind of got to go through and get the rudiments out of the way, and then we'll see what happens when we apply it to society as we look at Thomas Hobbes, and then later on we'll see what happens when we apply it to the mind with Sir Francis Bacon. So jumping right in, Newton is kind of the first really reckoning of this scientific age in the modern world. And he's surrounded with a lot of other smart scientific thinkers. These are guys like Boyle, Galileo, Descartes, Wren, Huygens. This is the age in which the Royal Society is founded with that motto, on the words of no man. So to say, we're not going to take any single authority, but rather we want to approach the scientific community. So science is going to be kind of this engine of progress and the ultimate arbiter of matters on truth. So Newton writes down what he calls his regulae. These are his rules for scientifically philosophizing. These establish the relationship between conjecture, observation, experiment, and theory. And this is going to put natural philosophy, what we would now call science, as the only thing that really has the tools to explain and then to change the world. So the 17th century is not just this new age of science, it's really the age of Sir Isaac Newton, who by the lights of the 18th century was a saint of science in the tradition of Bacon. So through his, I'm sorry, and I misspoke earlier, we're going to see what happens when we apply Newton to the mind through Locke, not Bacon. We've already been through Bacon. Okay, so we're seeing this very forward-looking, this very analytically rigorous way of thinking. And so let's go through some of Newton's token accomplishments. So he formulates the law of universal gravitation. The story goes the apple hit him on the head. We don't know if that's true. He explained the motion of heavenly bodies. So how do all those stars and planets and all that stuff, how do they stay up there and how do they keep moving through the sky? He is able to quantify the density of the Earth, which is a pretty impressive calculation. The trajectory of comets, so kind of what angle are they traveling at, and the mass of the sun, which I have no idea how he did. I'm actually kind of intellectually curious. Now, he explained the motion of the tides and tied them to the actions of the moon. He developed and named the concept centripetal force. You're probably also familiar with centrifugal force. That's when you spin things around and they raise up in the air and you let them go and they go flying, okay? Newton is the first one to really develop this new method of mathematics. So the story goes is that he was home from Cambridge because a plague was hitting London, so we can probably all relate to that. And he is home at his family's estate, and he's working on some physics problems. What a nerd. And he can't quite wrap his mind around it with the extant algebra and stuff he has at hand, so he invents the calculus. And then later on, a guy named Leibniz would come along about 8 years later, and he would develop another calculus. Now, when you and I study calculus in school, we're actually studying a combination of Newtonian and Leibnizian calculus. That's neither here nor there. Just know that he did it, okay? We get tempted when we talk about the lives of scientists or really thinkers in any kind of steady field to just kind of chalk their accomplishments up as, well, they took what the previous people had done and they improved upon that. Not so with Newton. With Newton, we're really seeing him bringing in this revolutionary new perspective in science that's something that's really never done before. So if we look at Kepler, for instance, on the laws of motion, he says, look, once force stops being applied, the motion's going to cease, okay? That gets replaced when Newton comes along and is supported by his calculus and says, no, there's new laws of motion. So Newton reduces the problem to this ideal mass, a single point. So think of that point back in geometry class, revolving around an abstract center of force. So it's really neither here nor there where it is, and it's really only in this idealized world of theoretical and abstract mathematics that Kepler works out. So if we get out of the mathematic classroom and we get into the actual world, little discrepancies seem to break the laws as he had them. So Newton's distinguishing between the truth and approximations. He calls these approximations hypotheses, a term that we're probably familiar with. We would probably call it an educated guess. So this is kind of giving us a standard that we can gauge empirical data with. So we're presented with data sets, we can see how well it holds up based on what we think. And so this is going to be a method in science. Well, Galileo comes along and seems to be kind of anticipating Newton's method. Galileo was really more into mechanics than he was into the astronomy that we typically think of him now, okay? Now, despite being into science, Newton was still kind of into some of that natural magic of the Renaissance, the natural science as it becomes scientific thought. We know that he had a bit of an interest in astrology, and he probably had a lot of interest in alchemy. So two interesting topics for you to go and look up at. One of the problems is apparently his dog knocked over a candle in 1693 and burned all of his alchemical writings. So maybe he had successfully turned lead to gold, and we'll just never know. He was a student of the Bible, and Newton never lost his faith in this idea that the harmony, the lawfulness that he saw was a reflection of God's plan. Remember, telos for the universe. We know that Newton struggled with depression, that he had had a very close relationship with the Smith mathematician Dudoulier, and that mathematical problems may have kind of been Newton's escape from the rest of the world. He was really kind of in this age that is very much taken with the romance of science. So book recommendation for you. If you're into such things, pick up a copy of Carl Sagan's Broca's Brain, B-R-O-C-A. It's reflections on the romance of science and is absolutely masterful and fascinating. So in the 17th century, it's a very much a commercial age. It's a globalized world. We've got worldwide trade taking place, and this generates some really fascinating technical problems, ranging from currency to shipbuilding, and it's going to look to science for answers. So let's tackle currency. How do I know that when I take my silver dollar or my shilling or whatever it is I have, a cowrie shell, that it's going to be worth the same to the people with whom I'm trading? Because if they're close enough to take my money, they're probably not worth trading for a profit. The whole idea of capitalism is I want to buy things low and sell them high. Okay, so that's one problem, is how do we work on the equivalence value of money? The other thing is, how do you build ships that are big enough to hold enough stuff to make it worth the voyage, fast enough to get it there quickly, strong enough to withstand, the rigors of the journey, and so on. So science is going to come in swinging on some of these problems. The Royal Society gets founded in 1660 at the center of this growing culture of science, and they're opposed to the authority of any single person. So they kind of become the repository for all of the world's greatest scientific thinking. It used to be that if you had something weird happen, out on the farm, a cow gives birth and it's got a two-headed calf or something like that, maybe you're going to call the local parish priest. Well, now they start calling these guys from the Royal Society. They're kind of the Ghostbusters of their day, but they're dealing with things scientifically. So Newton's one of the Society's presidents, as well as Robert Hooke, Robert Boyle, Christopher Huygens, Christopher Wren, a lot of these great minds that you've probably encountered in your biology class, your chemistry class, and what have you. So by the 18th century, the authority of science is really pretty widely accepted. And we're going to extend its reach into things like social organization, as we'll see next with Hobbes, morals, health, commerce, industry. Scientists are going to be the ones that they call on to resolve these things. So this age of Newton is really establishing the scientific worldview as authoritative and saying science is the only valid engine of progress now. So we really come out of this. Think about problems that we're faced with, whether it's the coronavirus, whether it's the best transportation plan, all of these types of things, we generally turn to a scientific approach. We've kind of got this ethos that no problem is really real unless it admits of a solution that can be reached by some specialized mode of attack. And any bona fide problem is soluble by some scientifically formulaic method or measurement. We are very much the children of Newton in this respect. If we go back to the ancient Greek thinkers, they said, look, some problems are just problems and you got to suck it up and deal with them. As we get into Newton's age, though, they're not willing to accept that. They want to not find an acceptable accommodation. They want to seek out and find a solution, so we don't have to have that be problematic anymore. And what this is going to do is really set up a guy named Thomas Hobbes, who's going to come along roughly contemporaneously and writes a very important book called Leviathan. Leviathan is one of those books, put it on your bucket list, read it before you die. You are going to be better for having done so. If you're following along in our home game, that is to say the lecture slides, it's on slide 32. You have the frontispiece. Today we call it a title page. They called it a frontispiece of Leviathan. You've got a lot of symbolism there. So I'm just going to kind of look at the top and go down. At the top, you've got a Latin inscription that is from the biblical book of Job that translates, "No power on earth is greater than." You have the eponymous Leviathan. A Leviathan is a Hebrew word that means like a giant sea creature. In this case, the sea creature looks a lot like Charles II, King of England, popping up out of the sea, and his body looks like Aquaman. It looks all scaly, but it's actually a whole bunch of little people that comprise that scaly looking suit. He's got the crown on. He's carrying a sword to symbolize that he's head of the state of England. He's carrying a bishop's crozier. That's the curvy hook shepherd's thing to show that he's also the head of the church. Thank you, Henry VIII. We've got the king's castle, the bishop's cathedral, the king's crown, the bishop's mitre, the king's cannon, the wrath of God, which is kind of ironically shown by lightning points. I like that. Got the pitch of battle, the points of logic, the king's court, the ecclesiastical court. And then we've got that subtitle for Leviathan on the thing in the center. It reads, "The matter, form, and power of a commonwealth, ecclesiastical and civil." Okay, so a commonwealth is exactly what it sounds like. It's all of our wealth or all of our abilities held in common. Ecclesiastical is just a fancy way of saying churchy. Civil, well, that's the state, civil. Now that matter, form, and power, think back to Aristotle. To know the thing, to understand the thing, is to understand the causes of that thing. We've got the formal cause, the material cause, the final cause, and the efficient cause. Well, the formal cause, recall, is the ideal, or the idea. So he's got the form, so that's check. The material cause, the matter, check, and power. Aristotle, or we would have called that the efficient cause, he's calling it the power. They mean basically the same thing. So where's the final cause? Well, the final cause is us. That is the final cause of this Leviathan if it works out. So what he's designing this for is kind of to scare us out of wanting to fight. This is written in the context of the English Puritan Civil War. So Oliver Cromwell kills King Charles I, beheads him, and takes over England, basically. And we see England drop from its zenith to its nadir, from its highest point to its lowest point, and we want to avoid a state of nature. So, Hobbes lives through all of this, wants to avoid it at all costs, and so he writes this book. So Hobbes's view basically is we're just objects in motion. If physics can explain the laws of motion, such as centrifugal, centripetal force, all of that kind of thing, then it ought to be able to explain us as well. So how do we get to this? Now, this is an age replete with great people. We've got René Descartes, Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, Galileo, also Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes honestly believes that if the universe can be reduced to a set of systematic laws and understood that way, we should probably embrace the same rational principle to practical problem solving. So this Leviathan, this is a social engineering work to kind of express that judgment. He wants to see if it's possible. So during Hobbes' life, we've got amazing political, intellectual, scientific things. It's changing England, it's changing Europe, it's changing the world. Hobbes had been classically educated. He had studied Latin and Greek. He had studied the arts and sciences. He was Francis Bacon's personal secretary for 5 years, so we can see where he kind of picked up some of those Baconian influences. When he's 15, he goes to Magdalen College, Oxford, and he studies scholastic philosophy, which you'll recall was an attempt, not always a successful one, frequently not in fact, to rationalize the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. He graduates, he goes, didn't really like it. So he takes off for the continent of Europe in 1610. Okay. He gets interested in politics and he turns to Thucydides. I should have brought out my copy of Thucydides. The library's back there behind me, so it's in there. Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. Now the Peloponnese, that's the Greek archipelago. The Peloponnesian War was fought between the Athens and the Spartans. Okay. The Athenians were philosophers, such as myself. The Spartans, if you've seen the movie 300, they were the badass warrior guys. Now, if Gerard Butler and I go toe-to-toe with swords, I'm probably not going home that night. The idea was the Spartans had won very, very easily because they had a dual monarchy, or what we might call an oligarchy, whereas the Athenians had a direct democracy. They voted on everything. Thucydides was an Athenian. He goes, look, the reason we lost is we tried to vote on everything, and the Spartans just came in and killed us. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's a pretty good summary of the book. So Hobbes develops this kind of prejudice against extreme forms of democracy. Remember, democracy is crassy, or ruled by the demos, by the mob, by the common people, by the plebs. So he goes back home in 1636, and he befriends Pierre Gassendi, who's going to be one of those materialists. He meets Galileo, and so he gets this idea of the new science of mechanics as applied to the social and political world. Sorry, you're hearing my moronic dogs outside. Hobbes exiles himself in 1640 after he publishes his Elements of Law, and this is what really lays the groundwork for the foundation of an absolute monarch. So a monarch with absolute power, complete control over things. It's during his exile that he tutors the guy who would become Charles II when they restored the crown. And Charles II, incidentally, is the guy who granted the charter to the Royal Society in 1660. So he gets back in England. Hobbes publishes his groundbreaking work, Leviathan, in 1651. And he gets interested in all of these issues about free will, determinism, and what is the nature of human nature. So Hobbes says, look, society is just another part of the natural world. If Newton and Galileo show that we can understand causal laws that govern the physical universe, why not also the smaller world of human society? Okay. So Hobbes is looking at this in the context of analysis and synthesis, breaking problems down to their constituent bits, analyzing them, and then hopefully putting them back together in a way that makes more sense to us. Leviathan starts by examining our senses, that empirical stuff. You see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, smell it, the means by which we know the world that's external to us. Then he talks about the imagination, the imago, where we get our images. That goes beyond, it reaches possibilities that are beyond our immediate experience. So immediately I experience, it's kind of cold outside. I got my front door open because I like the breeze, but I've got a sweater on because, well, but I can imagine when it's going to be much warmer again because, well, welcome to Texas. Then he goes through the train of associations that lead us through and into new, different directions. I've got family in Colorado where it's already snowing right now. So I can think about, oh, well, it's cold and it's colder there and it's warmer in other places and so on. All of this is a process of the mind. I've got this natural tendency and imagination towards discovery and invention. This is one of those things that distinguishes me from, say, my German Shepherd sitting out front there. Society is a fit thing for us to study. So in addition to being a philosopher, I'm also a social scientist. But first, we've got to think of some of these absurdities that are kind of caught up with human life, and we've got to identify them and carefully limit them. Hobbes says one of those central things of importance is speech, our ability to convey our meaning and intention by spoken language. If you recall back, the Stoics thought that was pretty interesting too, that was one of the most important things that we could do. So speech gives me power, it aids my memory, but it also lends itself to abuses. Very regularly, we reason with terms that have no settled meaning that can be agreed upon. It's raining cats and dogs outside. Well, just how hard must it be raining to be said to be raining cats and dogs? He was driving like a bat out of hell. How fast does a bat out of hell actually fly? Okay. There's something about the way in which we represent problems to ourselves in words that makes them soluble or not, clear or obscure. So sometimes we don't distinguish between these real, actual bodies and spiritus, immaterial things. So we might talk about infusing faith into people, making them believe in something. It doesn't have to be a religious context. Believe that your team is going to be the next one to win the series or the cup or whatever it is that they play for. I don't do the sports ball things. Okay. So if we think back to Plato, remember he had that criteria of existence. Things must be capable of acting or being acted upon. I am capable of acting. My coffee cup is about to be acted upon. So myself and my coffee, we both exist. We're kind of tied to that old Platonic idea though. And some of it has to do with those Platonic universals that maybe we grant them on some level of thinking real tangible existence. Only particular things, this coffee cup, this professor, can actually be said to have existence. Sometimes we treat metaphors like they were real. My friend really stabbed me in the back. Well, not literally, that would be a bad thing. But, or sometimes we adopt terms for which there really aren't real world references. The scholastics are mostly blamed for this, but some blame can be placed on our love of rhetoric. We really like it when language is pretty. We like when lyrics have some kind of melodious flow to them. We like language that can be expressed poetically. If you ever read a scientific manual, they're not fun. They're very precise and very clear, but they're not interesting. If, on the other hand, we read a novel, we find that the turns of phrase there are really what keep our interest going. Reality is physical reality. It's material reality. If we were to have a scientific understanding of mankind, we got to understand ourselves first and foremost as material entities. So society, being composed of a whole bunch of us entities, is then understood as this complex system made up of human matter and motion. Motion can either be, according to Hobbes, involuntary and reflexive. He calls that vital. My heart is beating right now, sending blood through my system. My lungs are breathing, oxygenating that blood, and so on. Or it can be voluntary and intentional, animal actions, taking another drink of coffee. Now, our motives and our desires prompt these volitional, intentional movements. We go towards what we want or away from what we fear and dislike. And ultimately, this comes down to pleasure and pain, something that we're going to see throughout a lot of philosophy. Our most fundamental desire, at the very core of all this, is we really just want to survive, okay? It's kind of grounded in these considerations of personal survival. Good and evil still have meaning, but in a Hobbesian account, that's owing to Hobbes, all they really mean is pleasure and pain. So he tells us in time of war, there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain. In other words, don't bother making that complex thing because you may or may not be able to sell it. There's no culture of the earth, no navigation, no use of commodities that could be imported by sea. Now, this would have been really scary to the Englishmen of his time reading this because they were wearing, cotton from Egypt, using spices from India, ink from China, tobacco from the New World, furs from the New World, all kinds of these different things that were imported from all over the place. There's no commodious or pleasing building, no statues, no palaces, no cathedrals, no instruments of moving and removing, such things require force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. Now, I've mentioned a lot of scientists, but this is also the age of William Shakespeare, of Christopher Marlowe, of John Donne, of all of these wonderful writers. And he says at the end of the day, in times of war, continual fear, danger of violent death, and the life of man, all people, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's solitary because you can't trust anyone. It's poor because you don't have all these nice things. It's nasty because who wants to live that way? It's brutish because people are trying to kill you. And it's short because one of them is going to succeed. Ultimately, what this is this is a Scared Straight video from Thomas Hobbes. If you're ever in need of midnight entertainment, go to YouTube and pull up the Scared Straight videos. All the little thuggy kids get sent to jail and they get partnered up with big bad cons, and they decide that they don't want to go to jail after all. Why do we do all this stuff? Well, it's fear of a violent death that moves us into a society. We know that if we're out there on our own and something big and bad comes along, we're probably not going to survive it. So we gather in a group to prevent our destruction of other people through violence. And after a while, we got to pick somebody who's in charge. And we go, okay, you're going to be the king. Because even if you suck as being king or queen or whatever you happen to be, it's still better than us trying to kill each other all the time. So that's the power of the Leviathan, the state represented as the ruler. And we as individuals, remember that commonwealth, we give up just enough of our power to the monarch that they've got sufficient options to protect us. And we're only going to be allegiant to this Leviathan as long as they're able to protect us, our interests, our lives, and so on. And this is where this concept of hedonism enters in. Hobbes's whole idea is based on hedonistic psychology. Hedonism is the seeking out of pleasure, okay? So an egotist personally feels superior to other people, physically, intellectually, whatever. I'm the smartest, the prettiest, the most talented, so on. An egoist, note the absent T, has a preoccupation with himself. It's still all about me, even if I'm not better than you. Okay, now, in a nutshell, the sovereign, the monarch, has the sole power of reward and punishment in the system. So by that power, we start to move away from punishment towards reward. And really, it's all about this self-regard, this self-preservation. Maybe it's based on honor, which kind of takes the place of reward, or we get away from reprisals, sort of the punishment. And this isn't a complex metaphor. He means this. Concord, that is con with cord, cordia, heart, with the same heart, in the affective state is just like health in the body. Sedition, leaving it, is sickness. Sedition leads to civil war. Civil war is death. It kills civic life. And these aren't metaphors, says Hobbes. These are exact correspondences. Hobbes is going to have a bit of a critique of Descartes. Descartes is going to reply to them. Not entirely convincing, but they are going to go back and forth, and reading that's kind of interesting sometimes. Hobbes is specifically taking issues with Descartes' rationalist mind-body distinction, how he makes that. What Hobbes is giving us here is a view of human nature as a part of nature and subject to those same governing laws. That what we do and develop to discover the laws and principles of nature, we can apply to human nature as well. This age of Newton is giving us these increasingly mechanistic ideas of the body and also society at large. And the Leviathan really illustrates this turn of mind very vividly for us. We're getting a social science starting to be developed pretty optimistically, and science is taking on this very scientistic flavor. We are very much in the throes of the Enlightenment at this point. And remember, you are going to want to write down those dates of the Enlightenment. That is 1596, the birth of Descartes, to 1804, the death of Kant. This is as far as we are going this evening. I, as always, invite you to put your questions or comments down in the comments, post them in the discussion on Canvas, and we will discuss them as soon as we possibly can. That's all for tonight. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.